The sun hung in the sky like a white-hot coin, pressing its merciless weight upon the valley below. Summer had come early that year, bringing with it a heat that seemed determined to scorch the very memory of spring from the land. Across the rolling plains of western Montana, the tall grass had already turned a brittle gold, whispering and crackling as it swayed beneath the endless blue canvas above. In this heat, the air shimmered above the narrow dirt path that wound its way from the river, distorting the distant horizon into wavering lines that danced and trembled like fever dreams. The only sounds were the relentless chirping of cicadas and the occasional rustle of wind through the parched field grass. Then came another sound, the desperate rhythm of bare feet against hard-packed earth. A child ran along the path, her small frame leaning forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her golden hair clinging to flushed cheeks, and her simple cotton dress bore the evidence of a hurried escape, a torn hem flapping against her ankles as she ran. Though no more than 8 years old, she moved with the desperate purpose of someone whose world had collapsed behind her. She ran as if her small chest might burst from panic, but she did not slow. She could not. Her mother's words echoed with each pounding footstep. "Run, Abby. Run and don't look back. Find help." Ahead lay a property she had only glimpsed from a distance, a modest ranch house with a weathered barn and corral. Smoke rose in a thin line from its chimney, despite the heat, and a lone figure moved along the edge of the fence line, hammer in hand. The girl didn't stop when she reached the gate. She didn't knock. She didn't have to. George Cutter had seen her coming from the edge of his corral, the small shape of her cutting across the horizon like a frantic bird. He set down his hammer without haste, wiped his brow with his sleeve, and stepped off the porch before she even reached the gate. His weathered face betrayed nothing of his thoughts as he waited for her approach. When she finally stumbled to a halt before him, her words tumbled out between gasping breaths and half sobs, her voice catching on dust and fear. "They tied my mommy to the rock by the river," she cried, eyes wide with terror. "They said to let her learn what it feels like to be a burden." Her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Please, she's burning. Please don't let her die." George didn't speak. His sun-browned face remained impassive as he absorbed her words. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he turned and strode across the barnyard with long, deliberate steps. He swung himself up onto his bay horse, without saddle or hat, the animal sensing the urgency in his movements. The child tried to follow her small legs, struggling to keep pace. She reached for the stirrup, attempting to pull herself alongside. George looked down at her determined face, then extended his hand without slowing. She grabbed it, and in one fluid motion he pulled her up to sit before him on the horse's back. The bay took off like it understood the stake's hooves slicing through the heat-heavy silence as they rode toward the river. The girl clung to George's arm, her thin shoulders tense with fear. "What's your name?" George asked, his voice low and steady against the rhythm of hoofbeats. "Abigail," she replied, then added with a child's formality, "but Mommy calls me Abby." "How far to the river, Abby?" "Past the big oak with the broken branch," she said, pointing ahead, "where the water bends around the big stones." By the time they reached the river bend, the sun sat directly overhead, a white-hot eye staring down without mercy. The heat seemed to press against them like a physical weight, the air so thick it felt difficult to breathe. The stones she'd been tied to sat low and wide in the shallow water, near the bank bleached smooth by decades of current. It had been a gathering place, once in better times a spot where children played and women washed clothes in the cool water. Today it served a crueler purpose. She was there crumpled, against it, arms slack at her sides. A woman in a simple muslin dress torn at the back, her skin flushed an angry red from hours under the merciless sun. Her hair, once long and lovely, Abigail had said during their ride, now hung in tangles matted with sweat and river mud. Her wrists were bound with fraying ropes secured to an iron ring that had been driven into the rock decades ago for tethering horses. Her lips were dry and split, her eyes closed against the glare. She wasn't crying. She was past that. George dismounted before the dust settled, lifting Abigail down beside him. The girl ran to her mother, falling to her knees in the shallow water that lapped against the stone. "Mommy, Mommy, I brought help. He came," she whispered, touching her mother's arm with gentle fingers. The woman stirred at the sound of her daughter's voice, but didn't lift her head. George knelt without a word, pulling his knife from his belt. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, untied the knots without jerking or tearing at her already raw skin. One by one, the ropes came loose. He dipped his handkerchief in the river and pressed it gently to her forehead. She winced at the sudden cold, and only then did she seem fully present. She opened her eyes and looked at him, not with gratitude, not with fear, but with a quiet question behind her gaze. Why, he didn't answer. Instead, he soaked the handkerchief again and carefully wiped her face, her neck, her arms, anywhere the sun had burned worst. When he'd done what he could to cool her skin, he gathered her in his arms as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. The fabric of his shirt darkened with the sweat from her skin. Abigail stood in the shallow water, uncertain. George glanced down at her, shifted her mother's weight to one arm, and reached for the girl's hand with the other. "Come on," he said simply. "Let's get your mama somewhere cool." The walk back was slow and silent. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words too soft to catch. Not a soul stirred on the road, just heat waves and old vultures circling high above. George's face remained unreadable, his jaw set in a hard line as he carried her weight without faltering. He took them to his barn first, not to his house. The barn was cool and dark and quiet, the thick walls blocking out the worst of the heat. He laid her gently on a hay bed near the window where the wind slipped through the slats, providing what little relief the day offered. "Abby," he said to the girl who hovered anxiously nearby, "there's a well pump by the house. Can you bring a bucket of water? Take your time so you don't spill." When she had gone, George fetched a clean cloth and a small tin of salve from a shelf. He returned to the woman's side, hesitating briefly before speaking. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I need to tend those rope burns. I'll be respectful." Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with effort. She managed a small nod. With careful hands, he applied the salve to her wrists where the rope had cut deepest. His touch was clinical, efficient, but gentle, the hands of a man who had tended wounds before. When he finished, he moved away, giving her space. Abigail returned with the water sloshing a little over the sides of the bucket in her eagerness. George thanked her with a nod, then soaked a clean cloth and wrung it out. "Here," he said, offering it to the girl. "You can help your mama cool down." While Abigail dabbed the cloth against her mother's forehead, George poured water into a tin cup and returned to the woman's side. He supported the back of her neck with one hand and held the cup to her lips with the other. "Small sips," he instructed. She drank, choking slightly at first, then taking in the water more steadily. When she had emptied the cup, she found her voice, though it came out as little more than a cracked whisper. "Why are you helping us?" Still he didn't speak. Instead, he walked to the door of the barn and returned with a faded quilt. He draped it over her, pausing to gently tuck a corner beneath her bare shoulder where the torn dress had slipped. Abigail looked up at him wide-eyed. "What's your name, sir?" "George," he said, the single word coming out rough, as if he wasn't accustomed to using his voice much. The girl offered a tentative smile. "I'm Abigail," she said, then added, "This is my mommy. Her name's Rose." Buck. The name settled in the air like a vow. Rose. George nodded once, then turned toward the door. "Rest now," he said. "I'll bring some food when you're ready." Outside, the ranch stood as it always had, half-finished fence lines, a crooked clothesline, chickens pecking at the dry earth. But something had shifted, some invisible current had changed direction. George stood on the porch for a long moment, looking out at his land with eyes that seemed to see something beyond the physical boundaries of his property. Later, he brought food, biscuits from the pantry, dried peaches, cold beans. He placed it near them, but didn't linger, stepping outside to give them space. The day edged toward evening, the worst of the heat finally beginning to recede. Inside the barn, Rose stirred again, managing to sit up with Abigail's help. Her voice was low as she spoke to her daughter. "Did you tell anyone else where we are?" Abigail shook her head. "No, Mama. Just like you said. I ran straight here." Rose nodded, wincing as she shifted position. "Good girl." She glanced toward the door where George had disappeared. "Did he ask any questions?" "No, Mama. He just came right away." Rose seemed to consider this, her eyes troubled. Carefully, she reached down to the hem of her dress fingers, searching for something sewn into the fabric. A small object was hidden there, a military badge, old and tarnished, stitched carefully into a secret pocket. She touched it briefly as if to make sure it was still there, then let the fabric fall back into place. "Abby," she whispered, "remember what I told you. Don't say anything about our things. Not yet." Abigail nodded solemnly, understanding in her young eyes that went beyond her years. As twilight deepened into night, George returned with a lantern. He hung it from a hook in the barn's central beam, casting a warm circle of light around the haybed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, the question directed at Rose. "Better," she said, though the words seemed to cost her effort. "Thank you for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing all he had done. George nodded, accepting her thanks without comment. He turned to go, then paused, looking back at them over his shoulder. "My house is just there," he said, nodding toward the door. "I'll be on the porch most of the night. If you need anything, just call." Rose watched him leave, confusion evident in her expression. When he was gone, she pulled Abigail close, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's hair. "Try to sleep, sweet girl," she murmured. "Will they come looking for us, Mama?" Abigail asked, her small voice tight with worry. Rose stroked her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. "Not tonight, they think." She stopped, unwilling to give voice to what those men believed they had accomplished. "We're safe for now." As Abigail drifted to sleep beside her, Rose remained awake, listening to the night sounds of the unfamiliar ranch. Through the slats in the barn wall, she could see George's silhouette on the porch, a darker shadow against the night. He sat motionless, facing out toward the road, a rifle across his knees. She wondered what kind of man would risk himself for strangers, expecting nothing in return. In her experience, men always wanted something. Her late husband had wanted a son she couldn't give him. His family had wanted someone to blame for their misfortunes. The neighbors had wanted gossip. The preacher had wanted submission. What did this quiet rancher want? That night, thunder rolled far off, soft as a warning. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain that never quite arrived. George lit another lantern and brought 2 extra blankets to the barn, careful not to wake them as he placed the blankets near the door. In the quiet, he sat outside the barn door, watching the lightning flicker along the distant hills. The woman inside was a stranger, but something about her stillness, her shame, the way she clung to breath, but not hope, it stirred something in him he hadn't touched in years. He remembered a time when he too had waited for someone to come, and no one had. The memory sat like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold. He didn't sleep. When dawn came and the rooster crowed, he heard quiet movement inside. Soft voices, a child's gentle laughter. He stood, stretching muscles stiff from the night's vigil, and stepped away from the door to give them privacy. He was at the well, washing his face in the cool water, when he felt someone watching. He turned to find the girl Abigail standing a few yards away, clutching an empty tin cup in both hands. "Good morning, Mr. George," she said with careful politeness. "Mama sent me to get water." He nodded, stepping aside. "How is she today?" "Better. She can sit up by herself now." Abigail pumped water into her cup, spilling only a little. "She says thank you for the blankets." George accepted this with a nod, then turned toward the house. "Wait here," he said. He returned moments later with a tin cup of warm milk and a piece of cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth. "For breakfast," he said, offering them to the girl. Abigail's eyes widened at the sight of the food. "Thank you, sir," she exclaimed, taking them carefully. As she turned to go, she hesitated, looking back at him with solemn eyes. "The men who hurt Mama," she said quietly, "they said God wanted to punish her because she's bad luck." George crouched down to her level, his expression serious. "Your mama isn't bad luck," he said firmly, "and God doesn't tie women to rocks in the sun." Abigail considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied with his answer. "That's what I thought too," she said, then hurried back to the barn with her treasures. George watched her go, something dark passing behind his eyes. He straightened up, looking toward the road that led back to town, his jaw tightening. Then he turned and walked toward the corral where his horse waited, already planning the day's work that would keep him close to the barn. Inside, Rose was attempting to stand, using the wall for support. Her legs trembled with the effort, but determination showed in every line of her body. When Abigail returned with the milk and bread, Rose managed a smile that transformed her face despite the sunburn and exhaustion. "Look what Mr. George sent," Abigail said, proudly displaying her bounty. Rose eased herself back down onto the haybed, accepting the cup of milk with hands that still shook slightly. "That was kind of him," she said, taking a small sip. They shared the cornbread, breaking it into careful pieces. For Abigail, it was simply breakfast. For Rose, it was the first meal she'd eaten in nearly 2 days since her brother-in-law had dragged her from the small room at the back of his house where she and Abigail had been living since her husband's death. Thomas Wade had died 2 winters ago, drinking himself to death after years of disappointment that Rose had failed to produce a son. His family had never forgiven her for that perceived failure, blaming her for everything from Thomas's drinking to failed crops and soured milk. They'd let her stay in the house until spring, then moved her to the barn, and finally yesterday they decided God needed to judge her worthiness. "The river will speak on his behalf," they'd said. "The river or the sun or the coyotes that roam the hills at night." Rose had no illusions about what they had intended. If Abigail hadn't slipped away to find help, she wouldn't have survived another day tied to that rock. As they finished their modest breakfast, Rose heard the sound of hammering outside. She made her way to the barn door, still unsteady, but stronger than the day before. Through the gap, she could see George working on the north fence, methodically replacing broken posts and tightening loose wire. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been doing such work for years, each motion efficient and precise. There was something almost meditative about the rhythm of his labor, something that spoke of a life built on quiet persistence rather than grand gestures. She watched him for a long moment, trying to reconcile this solitary, careful man with the one who had ridden out without hesitation to save a stranger. "He doesn't talk much," Abigail observed, coming to stand beside her mother. "No," Rose agreed. "I don't think he needs to." Throughout that day, Rose gradually reclaimed her strength. She ventured outside the barn, briefly feeling the sun on her skin with new wariness. She found a water pump at the side of the house and washed her face and hands, the cool water a blessing against her tender skin. By evening, she felt steady enough to try to repay some small part of their host's kindness. She found a broom in the corner of the barn and swept the packed earth floor, clearing away loose hay and dust. She straightened the blankets on the haybed and folded the quilt George had brought. When George returned from his work, he paused in the doorway, taking in these small changes with a glance. If he was surprised by her efforts, he didn't show it. He simply nodded, a gesture Rose was beginning to recognize as his primary form of communication. "I brought stew," he said, holding up a pot, "and there's bread." They ate together that evening, sitting on upturned crates in the barn doorway where the cooling air provided relief from the day's heat. George ate methodically, his eyes on the horizon more than his companions. He didn't press for conversation, but when Abigail asked about the chickens scratching in the yard, he answered her questions with patient simplicity. "How long have you lived here, Mr. George?" Abigail asked between bites of stew. 15 years, he replied. "All by yourself?" A shadow crossed his face. "Not always." Rose touched her daughter's arm gently, a silent signal to change the subject. Abigail, perceptive beyond her years, immediately launched into a description of a kitten she'd once had filling the silence with childish chatter. When they had finished eating, George collected the bowls and stood to leave. "There's a creek behind the barn," he said to Rose. "Water's clean if you want to wash." "Thank you," Rose said, looking up at him. "For everything." George shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "No need," he said gruffly. Then after a moment's hesitation, "Rest well." That night, as Abigail slept beside her, both lay awake, listening to the sounds of the unfamiliar ranch. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their eerie voices carrying across the open land. Closer, she could hear the occasional stamp of horses in the corral and the rustle of wind through the barn roof. Through a crack in the boards, she could see George sitting on the porch again, his silhouette outlined against the night sky. He remained motionless for so long that she wondered if he had fallen asleep sitting up. Then she saw the brief flare of a match as he lit a pipe, the small orange glow punctuating the darkness like a fallen star. She wondered what ghost kept him company through these long night watches. He had the look of a man who carried his past like armor, protecting and imprisoning him all at once. Rose touched the hidden badge sewn into her dress hem, feeling its contours through the fabric. Whatever George's secrets were, she had her own to keep. For now, at least, until she could be certain of his intentions. With that thought, she finally surrendered to exhaustion, sleep pulling her down into merciful darkness. Morning came with the first tentative notes of birdsong and the rooster's insistent crow. Rose woke feeling stronger, the worst of the heat sickness having passed during the night. Her skin still felt tight and tender, where the sun had burned worst, but the dizziness had receded. She stepped outside, breathing in the fresh morning air. The world held a different quality at this hour, a softness, a promise that disappeared as the day advanced. The dew that had settled during the night was already burning off under the rising sun, but for now the air felt almost cool against her skin. Movement caught her eye, George emerging from the small room attached to the barn that she guessed served as his tack room and sleeping quarters. He nodded when he saw her, then continued toward the house, returning moments later with that now familiar tin cup of warm milk and cornbread wrapped in cloth. "Morning," he said, offering them to her. "Thank you," Rose replied, taking the simple breakfast. She hesitated, then added, "I was hoping I might help somehow today to repay your kindness." George considered this, his expression unreadable. "No need for repayment. Please," Rose said. "I'm not used to sitting idle." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded once. "Chickens need feeding. Eggs need gathering, if you feel up to it." Relief washed through her at having some purpose, however small. "I can manage that." George showed her where the chicken feed was kept, then left her to the task while he attended to the horses. Rose worked slowly, still mindful of her recovering strength, but found comfort in the simple chore. The chickens clustered around her feet, pecking enthusiastically at the scattered grain, their quiet clucking a soothing counterpoint to the stillness of the morning. Abigail joined her, delighted by the chickens and the discovery of warm eggs in the nesting boxes. Her childish wonder at these ordinary farm occurrences brought a smile to Rose's face, the first genuine smile in longer than she could remember. As the day progressed, Rose ventured further from the barn, taking stock of the ranch that had become their unexpected sanctuary. It was modest but well maintained, bearing the marks of a solitary man's priorities. The essentials, barn corral, chicken coop, vegetable garden, were in good repair. The house itself was plain but solid, though she noticed the curtains hung unevenly and the porch steps needed mending. George worked steadily throughout the day, moving from one task to the next with quiet efficiency. He replaced rotted boards on the chicken coop, mended a section of fence, checked his small herd of cattle in the north pasture. Occasionally, Rose would catch him watching her and Abigail, his expression thoughtful before he turned back to his work. By midday, the heat had returned in force. Rose sent Abigail to rest in the shade of the barn, then attempted to fetch water from the well. The bucket was heavier than she expected, and halfway back to the barn, her arms began to shake with the effort. Water sloshed over the sides, darkening the dry earth at her feet. Suddenly, George was beside her, appearing so quietly she hadn't heard his approach. Without a word, he took the bucket from her hands, his fingers briefly brushing against hers in the exchange. He carried it the rest of the way to the barn, setting it down near the door. Rose followed, embarrassed by her weakness. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought I could manage." "No harm done," George replied, already turning back to his work. "Mr. George," Abigail called from the barn doorway, "is there a cat here? I heard something in the hay." George paused. "Barn cat had kittens last month. Probably one of them." Abigail's face lit up. "Can I see them?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Mother cat's friendly enough. They're up in the loft, far corner." As Abigail disappeared into the barn, chattering excitedly about kittens, Rose found herself alone with George for the first time. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unasked questions. Finally, Rose spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I want you to know we won't impose on you for long. As soon as I'm strong enough, we'll move on." George studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where will you go?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on escaping her brother-in-law's cruelty that she hadn't thought beyond survival. "I don't know yet. Somewhere they won't find us." "The men who tied you to that rock," George said carefully. "Who were they?" Rose looked away, her hands unconsciously smoothing her tattered dress. "My husband's family, the Wades." She swallowed hard. "Thomas, my husband, died 2 winters back. His family never forgave me that I didn't bear a son. Said I was bad luck. Said I cost them seed and legacy." George's expression darkened. "Your husband's brother, Jeremiah," she confirmed. "He's the eldest now. He let me stay in the house until spring, then moved us to the barn. And then yesterday," her voice faltered, "they said the Lord needed to judge me." She continued after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper, "that the river would speak on his behalf." George didn't respond verbally, but he did something small, significant in its simplicity. He took his hat off and placed it on the ground beside him, not for comfort, but for respect. It was a gesture from another time, one that acknowledged the gravity of her words without empty platitudes. "They won't come looking," Rose added, trying to convince herself as much as him. "They left me there to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "To die," George said flatly, completing her thought. Rose nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Then they'll assume they succeeded," he concluded, "unless someone saw me bring you here." "The road was empty," Rose said. "Abigail said she didn't see anyone when she ran for help." George nodded, considering this information. "Then you have time to decide what comes next." "Why are you helping us?" Rose asked suddenly, the question that had been haunting her since the moment he cut her bonds. George was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were simple, but carried the weight of personal understanding. "I know what it is to wait for help that doesn't come." Before Rose could respond, they heard Abigail's delighted laughter from inside the barn, followed by the tiny mewling of kittens. The moment of connection between them passed, but something had shifted. Some small barrier had lowered. George replaced his hat and nodded toward the barn. "You should rest. Heat's worse this time of day." As he walked away, Rose watched his retreating figure, trying to reconcile the man's gruff exterior with the gentle hands that had tended her wounds and the quiet compassion that had offered sanctuary without demands. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something other than fear and desperation. It wasn't hope, not quite. She had learned the danger of hope. But perhaps it was the first tentative step toward it, like the faint green shoots she could see pushing through the dry earth at the edge of George's vegetable garden. Later that afternoon, as the worst of the day's heat began to subside, Rose stepped out onto the porch where George was repairing a broken chair. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, painting the weathered boards of the barn in warm gold. She had washed her face and combed her hair with her fingers, doing what she could to restore some semblance of dignity to her appearance. Her dress was still torn at the back, but she had managed to pin it closed with a spare nail she'd found in the barn. "I'm not weak," she said suddenly, her voice barely above the wind. George paused mid-motion, turned to look at her, wiped his forehead with his sleeve and nodded once. "Didn't say you were." Rose crossed her arms, not in defiance, but to hold herself steady. "They said I was useless. Cursed. That's why my husband died. Why I couldn't bear again. Why the milk soured." George leaned against the porch post, tool hanging loosely in one hand. "You believe all that?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. Rose blinked, considering. "Sometimes," she admitted, squinting into the setting sun. "When enough people say the same thing, it becomes hard not to hear it as truth." George regarded her steadily. "I believe a lot of good things rot when folks speak fear with conviction." Rose looked away, surprised by how deeply his words resonated. There was a quiet wisdom in his observation, something that acknowledged the power of others' cruelty without accepting its validity. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and Abigail's voice as she spoke to the kittens in the barn. "Your girl seems happy here," George observed. A small smile touched Rose's lips. "She adapts quickly. Children do, I suppose." She paused, then added softly, "She's had to." George nodded, understanding in his eyes. He returned to his work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer filling the air between them. As twilight deepened, Rose felt a curious sense of peace settle over her. There was a quality to this place, something old and wide, that let you hear your own heart again, after the clamor of others' judgments had drowned it out for so long. That evening she cooked. Not much, just beans warmed over a small fire in the barn's corner hearth, some wild onions and dried meat she found in the pantry. Her hands hesitated at first, but then remembered what it felt like to feed someone else, to prepare a meal without apology or fear of criticism. She set the simple meal on a rough cloth spread over an upturned crate. George came in after dusk, smelling of sweat and pine sawdust. He sat without question on a wooden crate, his broad frame making the modest seat seem smaller. Abigail tucked herself between them, eyes bright with the day's adventures. "Your barn cat let me pet her kittens," she informed George. "The orange one is my favorite." "Is that so?" George replied. His usual terseness softened slightly when addressing the child. "I named him Copper," Abigail continued. "Is that all right?" "Fine name for an orange cake, yeah," George agreed, accepting the bowl Rose offered him with a nod of thanks. They ate in comfortable silence, the simple meal tasting better than it had any right to after the days they'd endured. Through the open barn door, they could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the evening sky. "Your girl says she wants a doll," George said after a few bites, breaking the silence unexpectedly. "Said hers got stepped on." Rose glanced at her daughter, who giggled, revealing a missing front tooth. "She told me she'd settle for a kitten instead," he added with the barest hint of amusement in his voice. "She's always bargaining," Rose replied, smiling despite herself at her daughter's transparent attempts at negotiation. They ate in silence after that, but the silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was shared, comfortable, in a way Rose had almost forgotten could exist between people. Later, as George stood to leave, Rose reached across the blanket and gently touched his wrist, surprising herself with the gesture. "Thank you for not asking anything of me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. His eyes met hers, calm and steady. "You already gave enough," he said softly, the simple statement acknowledging all she had endured without requiring her to explain further. Then he was gone, stepping into the darkness beyond the lantern's glow, leaving Rose to wonder at how such a quiet man could speak words that resonated so deeply. That night, as Abigail slept curled beside her, Rose lay awake listening to the night sounds of the ranch. The distant howl of coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the rustle of wind through the barn roof. Ordinary sounds unremarkable in themselves, yet somehow comforting in their steady rhythm. Through the cracks in the barn wall, she could see George's silhouette on the porch again, keeping his solitary vigil. She wondered what memories kept him company through these long night watches, what ghosts he conversed with in the darkness. She thought of the badge hidden in her dress, hemmed the secret she carried with her like a talisman. Not yet, she thought, not until she was sure. With that decision made, she finally surrendered to sleep her dreams for once, untroubled by fear. The days passed with a rhythm of their own, each one melting into the next like wax dripping down a candle. Rose's strength returned gradually, her body healing from both the exposure and the months of neglect that had preceded it. The angry redness of her sunburn faded, leaving her skin tender, but no longer painful to the touch. George maintained his quiet presence, neither imposing nor distant. He went about his daily work with the same methodical care, but Rose began to notice small changes in his routine. Fresh milk and warm bread appeared by the barn door each morning before the rooster finished crowing. The path to the well was cleared of stones that might trip unsteady feet. A small wooden stool perfectly sized for a child appeared near the chicken coop where Abigail had taken to helping with the morning feeding. One afternoon, Rose found a bundle outside the barn door, clean fabric, scissors, needle, and thread. She recognized the material as coming from curtains she had glimpsed through the farmhouse window, faded but sturdy. With careful hands, she cut and stitched, transforming the fabric into a simple dress to replace her tattered one. When George saw her wearing it the next day, he said nothing, but his eyes registered the change with quiet approval. A week into their stay, Rose ventured into the small vegetable garden behind the house. The soil was dry, but carefully tended, rows of beans, carrots, and potatoes growing despite the summer heat. She knelt, testing the earth with her fingers, noting which plants needed water and which were thriving. George found her there, gently loosening the soil around a row of struggling bean plants. Garden could use a woman's touch. He observed, his voice neither approving nor disapproving, simply stating a fact. Rose looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun. "Would you mind if I worked on it? I've always had luck with growing things." "It's yours if you want it," he replied. That evening, George left a small pouch near her quilt. Inside were flower seeds, wildflowers, he said, from a part of the valley few visited. She held the tiny seeds in her palm, staring at them like they were coins or promises. The next morning, she began clearing a small patch of earth near the barn, Abigail digging beside her, cheeks dusted with soil, eyes lit with purpose. Rose hadn't planted much anything in years, not since before her marriage, when she had kept a small flower garden outside her father's house. The familiar motions of her hands in the soil awakened old memories, bittersweet but no longer painful. As she worked, she glanced up to find George watching from the corral, his expression thoughtful. When their eyes met, he didn't look away, but gave a small nod before returning to his task. That night, she dreamed of her father's farm of sunlight through apple blossoms, of a time before shame and fear had become her constant companions. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a lightness in her chest that felt almost like peace. 2 weeks slipped by, marked only by the gradual healing of Rose's body and spirit. The bruises on her wrists faded from angry purple to yellowed shadows. Her hair regained its sheen, falling in soft waves to her shoulders, where she had cut it shorter, not from shame, but to start anew. The wildflower seeds she had planted pushed green shoots through the dry Montana soil, defiant in their determination to bloom. In these quiet days, Rose found her voice again. She spoke to Abigail without the constant undertone of worry that had colored their conversations for so long. Sometimes in the cool of the evening, she even sang while sweeping the barn floor, old lullabies her mother had taught her, songs she had almost forgotten she knew. Abigail flourished in this new environment. She followed George like a shadow when he allowed it, peppering him with endless questions that he answered with patient simplicity. The orange kitten she had named Copper became her constant companion, riding on her shoulder or tumbling after her through the tall grass. One morning, as Rose hung freshly washed laundry on the crooked line behind the house, She noticed a wagon approaching on the distant road. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if its occupants were taking careful note of the ranch and its inhabitants. Rose froze, clothespin in hand, as the wagon drew closer. A man and woman occupied the seat. The man didn't wave as they passed. The woman beside him clutched her shawl tighter, lips pursed in obvious disapproval. Their eyes lingered on Rose, recognition and judgment clear in their expressions. Rose stood motionless until the wagon disappeared around the bend. Only then did she release the breath she had been holding, her hands trembling slightly as she resumed her task. Rumors move faster than mail in these parts, and Rose felt the heat of them like a second sun. Word of her presence at George's ranch had clearly reached town. It didn't matter that she slept in the barn, while George kept to his room. Off the tack room propriety had been breached in the eyes of the community simply by her presence on his property, without the sanction of marriage or family connection. She didn't speak of it to George, but as always, he seemed to know. That night, as darkness settled over the land, he sat by the barn door, sharpening a blade with methodical strokes. Without turning, he said quietly, "They ain't your judges." Rose stepped into the lantern light and, holding 2 mugs of chicory coffee, one for her, one for him. The bitter brew was a poor substitute for real coffee, but it was hot and provided an excuse for conversation. "They'll say I'm shaming your house," she said, offering him a mug. George accepted it with a nod of thanks, then replied after taking a sip, "A house ain't shamed by who it holds, only by who it turns away." Rose almost cried, not from sorrow, but from the ache of being believed and after so long. She sat beside him on the rough-hewn bench, careful to maintain a proper distance. "May I ask you something?" she ventured after a moment of companionable silence. George nodded, his profile outlined in the soft lantern light. "You live here alone," she said carefully. "Have you always?" He was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "There was a time I'd known love," he said simply. "And then there was a time after." Rose waited, sensing there was more he might say if given space. "Her name was Sarah," he continued after a long pause. "She died in winter. Snow never felt the same since." He didn't elaborate further, but those few words painted a picture of loss Rose understood all too well. She had never loved Thomas. Their marriage had been arranged by her father to settle a debt, but she knew the hollow space that death carved into a life. "I'm sorry," she said softly, the words inadequate but sincere. George acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod, then turned the conversation away from himself. "Your husband's people, the Wades, they have influence in these parts." Rose tensed at the mention of her in-laws. "Jeremiah, my brother-in-law, fancies himself important. They own more land than most, though much of it is mortgaged. The bank tolerates them because they're an old family." She paused, then added, "They have the ear of Pastor Phillips at the town church. The kind of men who use God to justify cruelty." George observed, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "They believe their own righteousness," Rose replied. "That's what makes them dangerous." They sat in silence after that, watching the stars emerge in the vast sky above. The night air carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain that never seemed to reach them. In this shared quiet, Rose felt a curious sense of peace, not the absence of danger, but the presence of something stronger than fear. The next morning, Rose ventured further than she had since arriving at the ranch. With Abigail skipping ahead, naming clouds and singing to bees, she walked to the edge of the small apple orchard that grew behind George's house. The trees were gnarled and clearly old, but well tended, their branches heavy with small green fruit not yet ripe. Rose's dress, the one she had made from George's curtains, hung looser on her, now her body still recovering from months of deprivation. But her steps were steadier, her breathing easier in the clear morning air. She found herself glancing back toward the ranch house more than once during their walk. She hadn't entered it yet, maintaining the boundary between George's private space and the areas of the ranch he had opened to them. She wondered if that was kindness on his part or habit. She wondered if it mattered. As they turned back toward the barn, Rose saw a figure on horseback approaching from the direction of town. Her heart quickened with fear until she recognized George's solid frame and the distinctive gait of his bay horse. He had ridden out before dawn on some errand he hadn't explained. He dismounted near the corral, leading his horse in awed side before approaching Rose and Abigail. His expression was grave. "Town's talking of, he said without preamble. Rose nodded unsurprised. "I saw a wagon yesterday. They recognized me. Pastors have been asking questions about you, about me." He paused, then added, "About why you're here." "What did you tell them?" Rose asked, anxiety tightening her chest. "Nothing. Wasn't there to hear them." He glanced down at Abigail, who was watching them with solemn eyes. "Heard it from Miller at the feed store." Rose understood the unspoken warning in his words. The town's gossip was more than idle chatter. It was the first stirring of potential trouble. "Perhaps we should move on," she said quietly. "Find us somewhere else before—" "No," George interrupted, the single word firm and final. He looked at her directly, his gaze steady. "This is your home for as long as you want it." Something in his tone made Rose's breath catch. There was a certainty in his voice she hadn't heard before, a declaration that went beyond mere hospitality. "I won't bring trouble to your door," she insisted. "Trouble finds its own way," he replied. "Has nothing to do with you." That evening, storm cloud gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with long-promised rain. Rose helped George secure the chicken coop and bring the younger calves into the barn. The air felt electric, charged with the approaching storm, and something else, an unspoken tension between them that had nothing to do with weather. As they finished their preparations, the first fat drops of rain began to fall quickly, becoming a steady downpour. They retreated to the barn where Abigail was already curled up with Copper and his siblings, watching the rain through the open door. "Will it flood, Mr. George?" she asked, eyes wide with concern. "Not here," he assured her. "Land slopes away from the buildings. Your mama picked a good spot to plant those flowers high ground." Rose smiled at his deliberate reassurance of her daughter. It was one of the things she had come to appreciate about George. He never spoke down to Abigail, always addressing her questions with honest, thoughtful answers. As night fell, the storm intensified. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn. Rose sat near the door, watching the elemental display with a mixture of awe and unease. Marquise. George appeared at her side, offering a blanket against the cooling air. "Storm like this cleanses the land," he observed, his voice barely audible above the rain hammering on the barn roof. Rose wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, grateful for its warmth. "Or washes it away entirely," she countered. A ghost of a smile touched George's lips. "You've seen your share of storms." "Not all of them come from the sky," she replied softly. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Those are often the worst kind." A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the yard, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Abigail cried out in alarm, and Rose moved quickly to comfort her. "It's just the sky talking, sweet girl," she soothed, drawing her daughter close. "Remember what Papa used to say, thunder is just the angels moving furniture." George raised an eyebrow at this explanation but said nothing, allowing Rose the gentle fiction that comforted her child. As the storm raged on, George excused himself to check on the horses in the adjoining stall. Rose could hear him speaking low, reassuring words to the nervous animals. His voice, though too quiet to make out individual words, carried a soothing cadence that seemed to calm both horses and humans alike. When he returned, he found Abigail had fallen asleep despite the storm, curled against her mother, with Copper nestled in the crook of her arm. Rose sat stroking her daughter's hair. Her face softened in the lantern light. "She trusts easily," George observed, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the child. "Too easily sometimes," Rose agreed. "She sees good in people before anything else." "Rare gift," George said. "Hope she keeps it." So do I, Rose whispered, though the world seems determined to teach her otherwise. George settled on a hay bale opposite her, close enough for conversation, but maintaining the respectful distance he always kept. Your husband, he said carefully. Was he cruel to her as well? The question took Rose by surprise. George rarely initiated personal conversations, and never about Thomas. She considered her answer carefully. Thomas ignored her mostly, she finally replied. He wanted a son. When I gave birth to a daughter instead, he acted as if she barely existed. She stroked Abigail's hair gently. In some ways, that was its own kind of cruelty. George nodded, his expression somber. My father was like that. Preferred horses to children. At least horses could be trained to his liking. It was the first time he had shared anything of his own childhood. Rose recognized the offering for what it was, a small bridge extended between their separate islands of experience. Were you close with your mother? She asked, accepting his invitation to more personal conversation. She died young, he said simply. Fever took her when I was 9. I'm sorry, Rose said, the familiar words feeling inadequate against such loss. George shrugged slightly. Long time ago now? A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the steady drumming of rain and occasional rumbles of more distant thunder. The storm was moving on its fury spent. You dream of her, Rose asked suddenly. You're Sarah. George's expression shifted, surprise briefly visible before his features settled back into their usual reserve. Sometimes, he admitted, less often now than before. What was she like? The question had slipped out before Rose could consider its propriety. For a moment she thought she had overstepped. George's face turned toward the darkness beyond the lantern light, his profile rigid. Just as she was about to apologize for the intrusion, he spoke. Kind, he said, the single word weighted with memory. Laughed easy, saw beauty in ordinary things. He paused, then added, strong-willed too, had opinions about everything from politics to how a garden should be planted. Rose smiled at the fondness evident in his description. She sounds wonderful. She was, George agreed. Then after a moment's hesitation, he asked, your people before the Wades, what were they like? Simple folk, Rose replied. My father farmed near Helena before the drought took our land. Mother died, bringing my younger brother into the world. He followed her a week later. She sighed softly. Father did his best, but times were hard. When Thomas Wade offered for me, bringing the promise of a secure home, she trailed off the rest of the story clear enough. You were sold to settle debts, George concluded, no judgment in his voice. Traded, Rose corrected gently. Father didn't see it that way, but yes, I was 17. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle patter, the storm having spent its fury. The air that drifted through the barn door felt clean and new, carrying the scent of wet earth and growing things. You should sleep, George said, rising from his seat. Morning comes early, rain or shine. Rose nodded, suddenly aware of the late hour and the day's accumulated fatigue. Good night, George, she said softly. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Good night, Rose, he replied, his use of her name deliberate and somehow significant. After he had gone, Rose settled beside her sleeping daughter, pulling the blanket over them both. Outside, the world had been washed clean by the storm, if only temporarily. Inside, something had shifted between her and George, a tentative trust taking root like the wildflower seeds she had planted. As sleep claimed her, Rose's hand unconsciously sought the hidden pocket in her dress where the military badge lay concealed. Not yet, she thought hazily, but soon perhaps. Morning dawned clear and brilliant after the storm, the world transformed by rain and sunlight. Puddles dotted the yard, reflecting the cloudless sky like scattered mirrors. The air felt lighter, washed clean of dust and summer's oppressive heat, if only temporarily. Rose stepped outside, breathing deeply of the rain-freshened air. The wildflower patch she had planted showed new growth, tiny green shoots standing more erect after drinking their fill during the night's downpour. George was already at work repairing a section of roof on the chicken coop where the storm had dislodged some shingles. He acknowledged her presence with a nod, then returned to his task with focused attention. Rose went about her morning chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, pumping fresh water. These simple routines had become comforting in their predictability, giving structure to days that had once been measured only by fear and uncertainty. Abigail emerged from the barn, hair tousled from sleep, Copper trotting at her heels. "Mama, can I help Mr. George fix the roof?" she called, already moving in his direction without waiting for an answer. "You stay on the ground, Abby," Rose cautioned. "Hand him nails if he needs them, but don't climb up." George glanced down from his perch atop the coop. "Good morning, Miss Abigail," he said with unusual formality. "I could use an assistant if your mother approves." Rose smiled at this small conspiracy between them. "Just be careful, both of you," she said, watching as George showed Abigail how to sort nails by size, the child's face serious with concentration. There was something about seeing them together, her daughter and this quiet, steady man, that tugged at Rose's heart in unexpected ways. George treated Abigail with a gentle respect that Thomas had never shown, acknowledging her questions and small contributions as worthy of attention. As the morning progressed, Rose noticed a change in the air that had nothing to do with weather. A tension, a watchfulness had settled over George. He worked as methodically as ever, but his eyes frequently scanned the road that led to town, and twice she saw him pause in his task to listen intently as if expecting approaching riders. After Abigail had tired of nail sorting and wandered off to play with the kittens, Rose approached George as he gathered his tools. "You're expecting trouble," she said quietly, a statement rather than a question. George straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "Pastor rides out on Thursdays to visit outlying farms," he said. "Been doing it for years. And you think he'll come here today?" "Yes." Rose folded her arms across her chest, anxiety fluttering in her stomach. "Because of me. Because he's a man who believes in managing other people's business," George corrected. "You're just his latest excuse." Despite the reassurance implicit in his words, Rose felt the weight of impending judgment. "What will you tell him when he asks why I'm here?" George considered her question, his expression thoughtful. "The truth about him," he said finally, "that you needed help and I gave it. Nothing more needs explaining." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. In small communities like theirs, unmarried men and women did not share living quarters, however separately maintained, without raising questions of propriety and intention. "I could make myself scarce when he arrives," Rose suggested. "Take Abigail to the orchard until he's gone." George shook his head. "No hiding," he said firmly. "Not in your own home." The words hung between them, significant in their implication. Your own home. Not my home where you're staying or this place where you found shelter, but your own home. As if he already considered the ranch as much hers as his. Before Rose could respond, Abigail's voice called from near the barn. "Mama, Mr. George, come see what Copper can do." The moment passed, but Rose carried George's words with her as they went to admire the kitten's newfound ability to climb the barn wall, a feat that seemed to impress Abigail far more than its mother's long-suffering expression suggested it should. The pastor arrived shortly after midday, when the puddles from the night's rain had largely evaporated, and the heat had begun to reassert itself. He came on horseback, dressed in black, with a silver cross swinging from his neck as he rode. His eyes, cold beneath the shade of his hat, surveyed the ranch with undisguised disapproval. George was mending a harness near the corral when the pastor approached. He set his work aside unhurriedly and stood to greet the visitor, his posture neither welcoming nor hostile. "Pastor Phillips," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Cutter-based," the pastor replied, his tone clipped. He did not dismount, a deliberate choice that placed him physically above George in their conversation. "I'm here to inquire about the woman Rose Wade and the child. It's been said they're residing here improperly. George leaned against the corral post arms, crossed his voice as dry as the gravel under their boots. They're here because someone left them to deal, and I don't take kindly to ghosts haunting my land, Pastor. Pastor Philip's nostrils flared at the implied criticism. The Lord desires order, Cutter. Families belong with kin. This arrangement is raising tongues in town. Let them wag, George replied evenly. I answer to my conscience, not gossip. The pastor's expression hardened. You've always kept to yourself, Cutter. Folk have respected that. But harboring another man's widow without proper standing. Proper standing, George interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. Was it proper to tie a woman to a rock in the summer heat and leave her to die? Was it proper for her own kin by marriage to treat her worse than a stray dog? Before the pastor could respond, Rose stepped out of the barn drawn by the raised voices. She had known this confrontation was coming and had prepared herself as best she could. She wore the dress she had made from George's curtains, simple but dignified. She had washed her hair in the creek that morning and twisted it into a neat knot at the nape of her neck. She did not hide, did not tremble as she approached. Behind her, Abigail peeked from the barn doorway, hand resting protectively on Copper's head. The silence crackled between them like dry kindling, awaiting a spark. Rose felt the pastor's critical gaze taking in every detail of her appearance, searching for confirmation of his worst assumptions. Mrs. Wade, he said finally, the formal address, somehow managing to sound like an accusation. Pastor Phillips, she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. The community is concerned about your welfare, he said, though his tone suggested concern was the least of what the community felt. Your brother-in-law has inquired after you. Rose felt a chill despite the day's warmth. Has he, she asked, fighting to keep her voice neutral. Indeed. The pastor's eyes narrowed slightly. He was most distressed to learn of your situation here. I wasn't rescued, Pastor, Rose said firmly, finding strength in the simple truth. I was reclaimed from death, from shame, from lies. Mr. Cutter offered shelter when those who should have protected me instead sought to destroy me. Pastor Phillips regarded her with open skepticism. The Wades speak differently of the matter. I imagine they do, Rose replied, unable to entirely mask the bitterness in her tone. The pastor shifted in his saddle, his attention returning to George. You intend to marry her, then? The words hung in the air like judgment, waiting for thunder. George looked at Rose, then really looked, and in that moment he didn't flinch or look away, but he didn't speak either. The question hovered unanswered between them, loaded with implications. Rose's breath hitched only for a moment. When she spoke, her words were measured and clear. When a man saves your life without claiming your soul, Pastor, that's worth more than a dozen wedding vows. Pastor Phillips grunted, clearly dissatisfied with her response. He adjusted his reins and fixed George with a hard stare. The community has standards, Cutter, expectations of decent folk. You can't stand outside the law forever. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. If you love her, wed her or release her. He extended the paper toward George, who took it without comment and tucked it into his pocket without reading it. You best prepare, the pastor added as he turned his horse to leave. Her kin are coming by the week's end. The Lord's work will be done. With that cryptic warning, he rode off, the dust behind him, swirling like a portent. Rose and George stood in silence, watching until the pastor disappeared around the bend in the road. Only then did Rose release the breath she had been holding, her shoulders sagging slightly. What did he give you? She asked, nodding toward George's pocket. George withdrew the folded paper and scanned it briefly. Notice from the town council, he said, his tone neutral, expressing their concern about our living arrangement. Rose closed her eyes briefly, shame and anger warring within her. I've brought trouble to your door just as I feared. No, George said firmly. Trouble was already here waiting for an excuse. He refolded the paper and returned it to his pocket. Don't concern yourself with it. But Rose could see the tightness around his eyes, the tension in his jaw that belied his casual dismissal. The pastor's visit had confirmed what they both suspected. The peace they had found was temporary, threatened by forces beyond their control. He said they're coming, she said quietly. The Wades. George nodded, once his expression grim. By week's end. What will we do? George's eyes met hers, steady and resolute. We'll be ready. That night, rain threatened again on the horizon. George fixed lanterns to the barn posts and checked the lock on the corral gate. Oil lamps were trimmed low inside the house, casting long shadows across the yard. Rose braided Abigail's hair tight and laid out extra clothes in case they had to run. Even though she wanted to believe in George's steady confidence, years of disappointment had taught her to prepare for the worst. Escape had been her only strategy for so long, it was difficult to imagine another way forward. After Abigail had fallen asleep, Rose joined George on the porch. The air was heavy with the scent of coming rain, but the clouds seemed reluctant to release their burden, hovering dark and ominous on the horizon. I've been thinking about running, she admitted, her voice low to avoid waking Abigail. Packing up before they come. George didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the fields beyond the fence, dark and vast in the gathering dusk. I built this place with hands that buried the only family I had, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion rarely displayed. If you think I'm letting it become a hunting ground for men who hurt women and call it righteousness, you don't know me yet. Rose looked at him, then truly looked, and saw not just the quiet, solitary rancher who had taken them in, but a man of deep conviction and unwavering resolve. The part of her that had forgotten what belief felt like began to stir again. They'll paint me wicked, she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Say I seduced a lonely man with a broken heart. George gave a small, humorless smile. If you were wicked, Rose, I'd be on my knees thanking God for sending me something that still knew how to live. Rose laughed, then quiet and startled by the sound. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks, perhaps months. The sound seemed to surprise George as well, and for a brief moment his usual stoic expression softened into something that might have been a smile. They sat in companionable silence after that, watching as lightning flickered in the distant clouds. The storm was still far off, but its approach was inevitable. Tomorrow, George said after a while, I'll ride into town. There's a man there, another preacher named Otis Miller. He owes me a favor. Rose glanced at him, curious. What kind of favor? The kind that might help us prepare for whatever's coming. She didn't press for details, trusting that he would share his plan when he was ready. Instead, she asked the question that had been lingering at the back of her mind since the pastor's visit. Do you ever regret taking us in? All the trouble it's brought. George turned to look at her directly, his gaze unwavering. Not for a single moment. He said the words simple, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Rose held his gaze, feeling something shift between them, a current of understanding that went beyond words or physical touch. In that moment, she knew with certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The next day, George rode out early, leaving Rose with instructions to keep Abigail close and to prepare for visitors the following day. He didn't specify who these visitors might be, but Rose understood he was setting some plan in motion. She spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, moving between practical preparations, baking bread, mending clothes, ensuring the barn was tidied, and moments of quiet reflection. Whatever happened when the Wades arrived, she knew life would change once again. The brief respite they had found at George's ranch was coming to an end one way or another. As she worked, Rose found herself thinking about George's question to the pastor. Was it proper to tie a woman to a rock and leave her to die? The memory of that day still haunted her, the merciless sun, the rough stone against her back, the rope cutting into her wrists. But more than the physical pain, she remembered the moment when hope had abandoned her, when she had believed that her daughter would return to find only a corpse. And then George had come a stranger who owed her nothing, who had cut her bonds and carried her to safety without expectation of reward or gratitude. In the days since he had offered shelter, respect, and a quiet steadiness that had allowed her to reclaim pieces of herself she thought lost forever. The badge hidden in her dress hem seemed to weigh heavier with each passing day. Soon she would have to share its secret to trust George with the truth she had been concealing. But not yet, not until the immediate threat of the Wades had passed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Rose heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She tensed, fearing the Wades had arrived earlier than expected, but when she looked out, she saw only George returning, accompanied by a second rider, a lanky man with long gray hair tied back from a weathered face. George dismounted near the porch, the stranger following suit. "Rose," George called, "this is Otis Miller, former preacher, current horse trader, an occasional voice of reason in unreasonable times." The man named Otis stepped forward, offering a hand to Rose. His grip was firm, his smile genuine beneath a neatly trimmed gray beard. "Mrs. Wade," he greeted her, "George has told me some of your troubles. I'm sorry for what you've endured." There was no judgment in his eyes, only a compassionate understanding that immediately put Rose at ease. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller," she replied, "though I'm not entirely sure why you're here." Otis glanced at George, one eyebrow raised in question. George nodded slightly, giving permission to explain. "I still hold credentials as an ordained minister," Otis said, turning back to Rose. "Though I left the formal church, it was some years ago when their politics became more important than their principles." He smiled, a twinkle in his eye despite the serious conversation. "George thought I might be of service should you desire to formalize your situation here." Rose's breath caught as she understood the implication. She looked at George, who was watching her with careful attention, his expression giving nothing away. "I see," she said carefully, "and have you come to perform this service immediately?" "Not unless you wish it," Otis replied easily. "I'm in no hurry. Thought I might stay the night, help George with that fence he's been neglecting, and we can see how things stand in the morning." The gentle lack of pressure in his words confirmed Rose's initial positive impression. This was not a man who would force decisions or judge choices. "You're welcome to stay," she said. "We don't have much, but there's fresh bread and beans." "A feast fit for kings," Otis declared with a smile. "And far better company than I usually keep, which is mostly horses with opinions about everything." His easy humor lightened the moment, allowing Rose to breathe again. Whatever George had planned, it seemed there would be time to consider it carefully without the immediate pressure of a decision. As they settled in for the evening, Abigail took an immediate liking to Otis, especially after he produced a small wooden whistle from his pocket and taught her how to play a simple tune. The joyful noise filled the ranch with a lightness that had been missing in the tense days following the pastor's visit. Later, as Abigail slept and Otis retired to the spare bed George had arranged in the tack room, Rose and George found themselves alone on the porch once more. The night was clear stars, scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet. "You brought him here to marry us," Rose said directly, not a question but a statement. George nodded once. "If that's what you want." "Is it what you want, George?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. He was silent for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I want you safe," he finally said. "You and Abigail both. If marriage provides that safety, then yes." "But is that all?" Rose pressed, needing to understand his true feelings. George turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the faint light from the house. "No," he admitted, "that's not all." The simple acknowledgement hung between them, weighted with unspoken emotion. Rose felt her heart quicken, both in fear and anticipation. "I need to show you something," she said suddenly, reaching for the hem of her dress where the hidden pocket lay. "Before you decide anything, there's something you should know about me." Rose's fingers trembled slightly as she found the small pocket hidden in the hem of her dress. For weeks she had carried this secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal it, or perhaps for the courage to do so. Now, with George watching her intently and their future hanging in the balance, that moment had arrived. She withdrew the small object and held it out in her palm. The military badge gleamed dully in the faint light from the lantern, its brass tarnished with age and wear. It bore the insignia of a Confederate regiment from the Civil War. "This belonged to my brother," she said quietly. "He fought for the South while you fought for the North." George's expression remained unreadable as he took the badge, turning it over in his weathered hands. "How did you know I fought?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The way you stand sometimes. How you wake at the slightest sound, the scars on your hands." Rose paused. "And there's a Union jacket folded in your trunk. I saw it when I was sweeping the tack room." George nodded slowly, acknowledging her observations. "Your brother," he said, returning to the badge in his hand. "Which regiment?" "He served under Colonel Jackson," Rose replied. "He died at Antietam." George went very still. "I was there," he said after a long silence. "We killed many men that day." "I know," Rose said softly, "and I don't blame you. War makes us into different people, but we don't have to stay those people forever." George studied the badge for another moment before carefully returning it to her. "Why did you keep this hidden?" he asked, no accusation in his tone, only curiosity. "At first I didn't trust you," Rose admitted. "The Wades are still bitter about the war, even all these years later. They would have thrown me out immediately if they'd known my brother fought for the South. They were Northern sympathizers, though none of them actually fought." She sighed. "Later, I just wasn't sure how you would feel about it. The war left deep wounds in many men." "Yes," George agreed, his voice distant with memory, "though time heals some of them." They sat in silence for a moment, the confession hanging between them, like a bridge fragile but connecting them nonetheless. "Does this change things?" Rose asked finally. "Your offer through Otis?" George shook his head. "No," he said simply. "The war is long over, Rose, and we've all lost enough to it already." Relief washed through her, followed by a wave of emotion she couldn't immediately name. It felt like gratitude, but also something deeper, a recognition that this quiet, steadfast man saw her clearly and accepted her anyway, past and all. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for what she felt. George nodded once, then turned his gaze back to the stars overhead. They sat together in companionable silence until the chill of the night air finally drove them inside. The next day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect late summer morning that seemed designed to mock the tension running through the ranch. George was up before dawn, checking fences and readying the barn. Otis helped with the morning chores, his cheerful presence a welcome counterpoint to the day's underlying anxiety. Rose found herself moving through familiar tasks with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. She had slept little, turning George's words over in her mind. "The war is long over, Rose, and we've all lost enough to it already." There was a wisdom in his simple statement that resonated deeply with her. The past, with all its hurts and losses, could not be changed, but perhaps it didn't have to determine the future. As midday approached and Abigail played near the wildflower patch Rose had planted, now showing the first hints of colorful blooms among the green shoots. Her laughter carried across the yard, a reminder of innocence amidst the adult concerns that hung heavy in the air. George approached Rose as she hung laundry, his expression serious. "They'll come soon," he said without preamble, "probably before sundown." Rose nodded, her hand stilling on the damp cloth she'd been pinning to the line. "What do you plan to do?" "Stand," he said simply. "Make it clear they're not welcome unless they come in peace. And if they don't," George's eyes hardened, "then they'll learn what it means to threaten what's mine." The possessive claim sent an unexpected warmth through Rose, even as she worried about the potential for violence. "I don't want bloodshed on my account," she said firmly. "Nor do I," George agreed. "But I won't let them harm you or Abigail Rose. Some lines can't be crossed." Before she could respond, Otis called from near the house, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Riders coming, 4 of them by the dust. The moment they had been preparing for had arrived. Rose felt a surge of fear, quickly followed by a steely resolve. She would not cower before these men again. Abby, she called to her daughter, come here, please, right now. Abigail looked up from her play, sensing the urgency in her mother's tone. She ran to Rose's side, her expression solemn. Remember what we talked about? Rose asked, crouching to her daughter's level. If things get frightening, you go straight to the root cellar behind the house and stay there until one of us comes for you. Abigail nodded, her small face serious. Yes, Mama, I remember. Good girl. Rose brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, then straightened as the riders came into view. George stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching men and Rose. Otis moved to stand nearby, his usual cheerful expression replaced by watchful alertness. 4 men rode into the yard, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. At their head was Jeremiah Wade, Rose's brother-in-law, his face bitter and flushed with what Rose recognized as the early effects of drink. The men with him were ranch hands from the Wade property, rough men chosen for their size and willingness to follow orders without question. They dismounted as one, Jeremiah stepping forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating others into compliance. She's coming with us, he spat, pointing at Rose as if she were something diseased. Her and the brat, Wade blood don't get raised under bastard roofs. George didn't move. His voice didn't rise as he replied, you tied her to a rock and left her for the sun. I figure you gave up your right to speak about family. Jeremiah's face darkened with anger. She's a liar, a barren witch. Our brother died with nothing to his name because of her. George's voice turned to steel. He died because he drank himself through 4 winters and didn't know how to care for more than his own boots. One of the men behind Jeremiah reached toward his belt where a pistol was holstered. George raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, just a gesture, but enough to make the man hesitate. You'll walk away now, George said, calm but unshakable. You'll ride out and forget she ever knew you. And if we don't, Jeremiah asked, teeth bared in what might have been a smile on a different face. George stepped forward, his expression unchanging, but his eyes holding something terrible and beautiful in their depths. Then I won't bury what's left of you. There was a tense silence. Wind whistled through the high grass. A cloud passed before the sun, casting momentary shadow across the confrontation. In the stillness, Abigail suddenly darted forward, breaking free of Rose's grasp. Before anyone could stop her, she positioned herself between George and the men, her small frame practically vibrating with protective fury. Don't hurt my papa, she cried, the unexpected words falling like stones into the tense silence. Everyone froze. George looked at Rose, confusion evident in his eyes. Jeremiah's bitter expression transformed into one of malicious delight. Well, well, he drawled. Seems the girl's been told some pretty tales. He looked at Rose with contempt. Or perhaps the witch has been busy indeed. Abby, Rose called, her voice tight with fear. Come back here now, Am. But Abigail stood her ground, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. You're bad men, she declared with a child's forthright conviction. You hurt my mama, and now you want to hurt my papa. Your papa, Jeremiah repeated with mocking emphasis. Is that what they've told you, girl? That this man is your father? Enough, George said, his voice cutting through the tension. He moved forward, placing a protective hand on Abigail's shoulder. The child has nothing to do with this. Oh, but she does, Jeremiah countered, his eyes gleaming with malice. Especially if she's being raised on lies. One of the men behind him shifted uncomfortably. Jeremiah, he muttered. Maybe we should just go. This ain't worth getting shot over. Jeremiah ignored him, his attention fixed on Rose with burning intensity. You always were clever, he said. Found yourself a new protector quick enough, didn't you? probably warming his bed before Thomas was cold in his grave. Rose felt a surge of anger that burned away her fear. Thomas was cruel and drunk and careless. She said, her voice steady. He died alone because that's how he lived alone, even with people around him. You're no different, Jeremiah. Just another Wade man hiding his weakness behind cruelty. Jeremiah's face contorted with rage. He took a step forward, hand moving toward his gun. You'll regret those words, woman. That's quite enough, Otis interjected, stepping forward with surprising authority for a man of his lanky build. I believe you gentlemen have said your piece and been given your answer. I suggest you take it and leave while you still can. Jeremiah eyed the newcomer suspiciously. And who might you be? Otis Miller, he replied evenly. Former minister, current witness to 4 men threatening a woman and child on another man's property. He paused significantly. The kind of witness who rides circuit through 6 counties and knows every judge by name. This introduction seemed to give Jeremiah pause. Legal complications were evidently not part of his planned intimidation. This isn't over, he said finally, backing toward his horse. The law's on our side. She's a Wade by marriage and the child, too. The law recognizes new marriages as well, Otis commented mildly. Should one occur. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed as he looked between George and Rose. So that's your game, he said. Well, it won't work. Pastor Phillips won't marry you. He knows what she is. Good thing I don't need Pastor Phillips then, Otis replied with the ghost of a smile. For the first time, uncertainty showed in Jeremiah's expression. He mounted his horse, gesturing for his men to do the same. This isn't finished, he warned, looking directly at George. You've made an enemy today, Cutter. Wouldn't be the first time, George replied, unmoved. Without another word, Jeremiah wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following close behind. The dust of their departure hung in the air like a warning. Only when they had disappeared from sight did George relax his stance. He looked down at Abigail, who still stood protectively beside him, and placed a gentle hand on her head. That was brave, he said quietly, but dangerous. Your mama was frightened for you. Abigail looked up at him, her expression earnest. I didn't want them to hurt you. I appreciate that, George replied seriously. But next time, listen to your mama. She knows best how to keep you safe. Rose approached them, her legs unsteady with the aftermath of fear and relief. She knelt beside her daughter, drawing her into a tight embrace. Oh, Abby, she whispered. You scared me so. I'm sorry, Mama, Abigail murmured against her shoulder. But I couldn't let them hurt Mr. George. He takes care of us. Rose met George's eyes over her daughter's head, seeing in them a reflection of her own complicated emotions, concern, relief, and something deeper that neither of them had yet put into words. Yes, she agreed softly. He does. Otis cleared his throat discreetly. I believe I'll check on the horses, he said. Make sure our visitors didn't upset them too badly. With that transparent excuse, he moved off toward the corral, giving them privacy. When Abigail had been calmed and sent to play with Copper under the watchful eye of his mother, Cat Rose, and George found themselves alone near the porch steps. She called you Papa, Rose said, addressing the elephant that had entered their relationship. George nodded, his expression thoughtful. Children need anchors, he said simply, especially in storms. I didn't tell her to say that, Rose clarified. She decided on her own. Children see things clearly sometimes, George replied. Things adults complicate with too many words. Rose studied his face, trying to discern his true feelings about Abigail's declaration. Does it bother you? Her thinking of you that way? George considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. It honors me. The simple statement, delivered without elaboration, exemplified everything Rose had come to appreciate about this man. His straightforward honesty, his lack of pretense, his ability to accept what life offered without demanding it be otherwise. The Wades will be back, she said, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. or they'll find another way to cause trouble. Yes, George agreed, though Otis gave them something to think about with that talk of marriage. Rose felt her cheeks warm slightly. Yes, he did. A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken possibilities. I should check on Abigail, Rose said finally. George nodded. I'll help Otis with the horses. As they parted each to their respective tasks, Rose felt the phantom sensation of words unsaid hovering between them, a conversation postponed but increasingly inevitable. That evening, after a simple supper, shared in the unusual luxury of George's kitchen, rather than the barn, Otis entertained them with stories from his days as a circuit preacher, tales that somehow managed to be both amusing and gently insightful about human nature. Abigail listened wide-eyed until her yawns became too frequent to ignore, and Rose put her to bed in the small room off the kitchen that George had cleared for their use. When she returned, she found George and Otis in serious conversation on the porch, their voices too low to make out the words. They fell silent as she approached, but not in a way that suggested secrecy, more like men who had reached the natural conclusion of a topic. Fine night, Otis observed, looking up at the star-strewn sky. Reminds me why I prefer sleeping under this ceiling to any man-made one. Will you stay another day? Rose asked, settling onto the bench beside George. Otis smiled, the expression gentle in his weathered face. That depends on you folks, I suppose. My business here isn't finished unless you say it is. The implication was clear, and Rose felt a flutter of nervous anticipation in her stomach. She glanced at George, trying to read his expression in the faint light from the kitchen window. I think, George said carefully, that's a conversation for Rose and Ma to have privately. Otis nodded, rising from his seat with the fluid grace of a much younger man. Then I'll bid you both good night and find my bed. No rush to decisions, I've nowhere pressing to be. After he had gone, silence settled between Rose and George, punctuated only by the distant call of an owl and the soft creak of the porch boards beneath them. What Abigail said today, Rose began hesitantly, about you being her papa. We don't need to make decisions based on a child's words, George interrupted gently. Children say many things. Yes, Rose agreed, but sometimes they see truth before we're ready to acknowledge it. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The Wades will come back, George, or they'll find another way to try to take Abigail. As long as I'm a widow with no protection, they'll believe they have a claim. George nodded, his expression grave. I know. Marriage would solve that problem. Rose continued, her voice steady despite the churning of her stomach. It would give Abigail a father in the eyes of the law, and me a husband whose authority would supersede my brother-in-law's claims. Yes, George agreed, it would do those things. Rose studied his face in the dim light, frustrated by his inscrutability. But is that all it would be? A legal arrangement for protection? George was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the last purple light of dusk was fading into true night. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. No, he said simply. Not for me. The admission hung in the air between them, honest in its simplicity. Not for me either, Rose whispered. George turned to look at her, then really look at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his expression was completely unguarded. What she saw there, longing, hope, fear, resolve, mirrored her own complicated emotions so perfectly that she felt tears spring to her eyes. I've been alone a long time, he said quietly. Thought I'd always be. Then you and Abigail came, and suddenly this place felt like a home again, not just somewhere I exist. Rose nodded, understanding completely what he meant. I forgot what it felt like, she admitted. To be seen as a person, not just a responsibility or a disappointment. You gave that back to me, George. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid against her skin. I'm not a man of many words, he said. But I want you to stay, Rose. You and Abigail both. Not just for safety or convenience, but because he paused, searching for the right words. Because you make the world feel right again. It wasn't a traditional declaration of love, but to Rose it was more meaningful than any poetic speech could have been. This was George honest, straightforward, genuine in every word and deed. I want to stay, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. Not just because it's safe here, but because, for the first time in years, I feel like myself again when I'm with you. George's hand tightened around hers, a silent acknowledgement of her words. They sat together in the gathering darkness, connected by that simple touch and the understanding that had grown between them, an understanding too profound to need elaborate expression. So, Rose said finally, a small smile touching her lips. Should we tell Otis he has work to do tomorrow? George's answering smile was rare and transformative, changing his entire face from its usual stoic lines to something unexpectedly gentle. I think we should, he agreed. That night, Rose slept better than she had in years, a deep and dreamless rest, unmarred by the anxiety that had been her constant companion for so long. Tomorrow would bring change, but for once it was change she welcomed rather than feared. Morning came with the first tentative notes of birdsong and the rooster's insistent crow. Rose woke to find Abigail already up, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the small cot they shared, playing with Copper, who had somehow found his way into the house overnight. Good morning, sweet girl, Rose said, sitting up and smoothing her daughter's hair. Morning, Mama, Abigail replied cheerfully. Mr. George is already outside. He's fixing something by the barn, and Mr. Otis is making breakfast. He let me crack the eggs. Rose smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm, heart full at the simple domestic scene. That sounds wonderful. Let me get dressed, and we'll go see what they've made. In the kitchen, she found Otis presiding over a skillet of eggs and bacon, with the confidence of a man accustomed to cooking for himself. He greeted her with a warm smile and a mug of steaming coffee. George mentioned you might have news for me this morning. He said, his tone casual, but his eyes twinkling with knowing amusement. Rose felt a blush warm her cheeks. Yes, she confirmed. If you are still willing, we'd be grateful for your services today. Otis nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. I thought as much. Been carrying a marriage certificate in my saddlebag for years, waiting for the right occasion. Seems today's the day. After breakfast, Rose walked with Abigail to the edge of the small apple orchard. The day was clear and bright, the air fresh with the scent of ripening fruit and sun-warmed grass. Abigail skipped ahead, naming clouds and singing to herself, while Rose followed more slowly, lost in contemplation of the step she was about to take. She had not loved Thomas. Their marriage had been a transaction, not a choice. This time was different. This time she was choosing for herself based not on necessity or coercion, but on genuine feeling. As they turned back toward the house, Rose saw George standing near the corral, deep in conversation with Otis. Even at a distance, his solid presence brought a sense of calm certainty to her decision. Mama, Abigail said, tugging at her hand, is Mr. George going to be my papa for real now? Rose looked down at her daughter's earnest face, marveling at the child's intuitive understanding of the day's significance. Would you like that, Abby? Abigail nodded vigorously. Yes, he's kind to us, and he makes you smile. Papa never made you smile. The simple observation, delivered with a child's unfiltered honesty, brought tears to Rose's eyes. You're right, she agreed softly. He does make me smile. Then he should be my papa, Abigail declared with the absolute certainty only children can muster. And we should stay here forever. Rose squeezed her daughter's hand. That's what we're planning to do, sweet girl. Throughout the day, a quiet anticipation built around the ranch. George disappeared for several hours, returning with his bay horse lathered from a hard ride. He offered no explanation for his absence, But when he emerged from the house later, he was wearing a clean shirt, perhaps his only one, Rose thought, with a rush of affection. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, bathing the land in golden light, George approached Rose where she stood near her wildflower patch. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about where to do this." Rose looked up at him, curious. "The house would be traditional," she suggested. George shook his head. "I had somewhere else in mind, if you're willing." His expression held a question, an uncertainty, that made her realize how important this was to him. "Where?" she asked. "The river rock," he said quietly. "Where I found you." Rose's breath caught at the unexpected suggestion. "The rock," she repeated, unsure she had heard correctly. George nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "This is where you were left," he explained softly. "And if it's all right by you, I want it to be where something new begins." The significance of his choice struck Rose with unexpected force. The place of her greatest humiliation and suffering transformed into a site of new beginnings. It was a powerful statement, a reclaiming of narrative that resonated deeply with her own desire to build a new life from the ashes of the old. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "I think that's perfect." Relief and something like joy flashed across George's usually stoic features. "Good," he said simply. "Otis is ready whenever we are." As the golden light of late afternoon settled over the land, a small procession made its way toward the river, George leading the way, Rose and Abigail following with Otis bringing up the rear. They walked in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the significance of the moment. When they reached the river bend, Rose was surprised to see the transformation George had wrought. The rock, once a symbol of her suffering, had been adorned with wildflowers, not from her garden, which was only beginning to bloom, but gathered from across the surrounding meadows. Bright yellow, purple, and white blossoms covered the stone surface, their colors vivid against the weathered gray. "George," she breathed, taking in the unexpected beauty. "When did you do this?" "This morning," he replied, a hint of uncertainty in his tone. "Is it all right?" "It's perfect," she assured him, deeply moved by the gesture and all it represented. Otis cleared his throat. "If y'all don't mind, I'd rather do this before the sun fully sets. My eyes don't take kindly to twilight." George smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. Rose laughed, the sound catching in her throat like wind through chimes. Abigail placed Copper down beside the stone and held both their hands, forming a physical connection between them as they stood before Otis in the fading golden light. "We're gathered here," Otis began, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air, "not in a grand church or fancy parlor, but in God's own cathedral under the weight of sky and silence. We come to witness two souls who've seen darkness, choose light instead, who've known loss and still found the courage to love again." His simple eloquence, free from the pompous formality Rose had expected, brought tears to her eyes. This was real, honest, and unadorned, like George himself. Otis spoke briefly of commitment and care, of building a life founded on respect and understanding. His words were few but well chosen, addressing not an abstract ideal of marriage, but the specific reality of the two people standing before him. When it came time for their performance, George turned to face Rose fully, his eyes steady on hers. "I take you as you are," he said simply, "with your past and your hopes. I promise to stand beside you, to protect what we build together, and to remember always that strength isn't in silence, but in how we carry each other's burdens." The words, clearly considered carefully beforehand, touched Rose deeply. This was no rote recitation of traditional vows, but a personal commitment shaped by their specific journey. When her turn came, Rose's voice was clear, despite the emotion tightening her throat. "I choose you freely," she said, holding George's gaze. "After knowing captivity, that choice means everything. I promise to build with you, to trust in your steadiness, and to help make this house we share into a true home filled with warmth and honesty." Otis nodded approvingly. "By the authority vested in me, though, some might debate how much that is these days." This drew a small chuckle from all of them, breaking the solemnity of the moment in exactly the right way. I pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of Poe and any who care to acknowledge it. He looked at George with a twinkle in his eye. You may kiss your bride if she's amenable. Rose felt a moment of nervous anticipation. They had never shared such intimacy before. But as George leaned forward, his movements careful and respectful, she met him halfway. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise of companionship rather than passion, though the potential for more hummed beneath the surface. Abigail clapped delightedly, then threw her arms around both their legs in an exuberant embrace. We're a family now, she exclaimed, her joy infectious. There were no rings, but George pressed a coin into Rose's palm, warm from his pocket, etched with a star on one side and a faded heart on the other. It's from my mother's keepsake box, he explained. Only thing she left behind. Rose closed her hand around it. Then I'll keep it close, she promised. They shared no further kiss, not yet. Just a long, steady look, the kind only people who've seen death and decided to live again can give. In that gaze was an understanding respect in the tentative beginnings of something that might, with time and nurturing, grow into love. That night, the ranch didn't sleep. It hummed with new energy. Lanterns glowed in every window of the house that was now truly their shared home. A Rose's first attempt in years cooled on the windowsill, its crust imperfect, but made with care. George sat on the porch, Rose beside him, their hands brushing gently over and over in the darkness. The touch was tentative, new, but filled with promise. The wind returned kinder now, and the land once scorched by cruelty felt like it was learning how to bloom again. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to this small, profound beginning. What happens now? Rose asked softly, not in fear, but genuine curiosity about the shape their life would take. George considered the question. We build, he said simply, day by day, season by season. Rose nodded, satisfied with his answer. The future stretched before them. Not without challenges, the Wades would surely make further trouble, and life on a small ranch was never easy. But for the first time in years, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Abigail appeared in the doorway, sleepy but reluctant to end such a special day. Mama, Papa, she called the new title for George, coming naturally to her lips. Rose looked to George, curious how he would respond to this first use of the name, since their marriage made it official. His expression softened visibly, a vulnerability there that he rarely showed. Come here, little one, he said, opening his arm in invitation. Abigail ran to them, climbing into George's lap without hesitation. He held her awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence as she settled against his chest. Tell me a story, Papa, she requested through a yawn. George looked momentarily panicked, his eyes meeting Rose's in silent plea for help. Rose smiled encouragingly, but didn't intervene, giving him space to find his own way in this new role. Once, he began hesitantly, there was a house that stood alone for a very long time. It was a good house, strong and solid, but it was quiet, too quiet. His voice gained confidence as he continued. Then one day a small family came to the house. They brought laughter and songs and even flowers to plant in the yard. And the house, which had been just a building before, began to remember what it was like to be a home. Abigail's eyes drooped as she listened, her small body growing heavier with approaching sleep. Did they live happily ever after? She murmured. George looked at Rose, something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression. They lived truthfully ever after, he answered carefully, which isn't always happy but is better in the long run. Rose reached over to take his hand, entwining her fingers with his, in silent agreement with his wisdom. As Abigail drifted to sleep in George's arms, Rose felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The path that had led them here had been marked by suffering and loss, but perhaps those experiences had prepared them to recognize and appreciate the peace they had found together. The night stretched around them, vast and full of stars. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this moment, they had created something precious and rare. A family built not on obligation or convention, but on choice, respect, and the quiet courage to begin again. The land once scorched by cruelty felt like it was learning how to bloom again, and so were they.